Hi, welcome back to my Smart Learning. This is an A-level biology lesson for my year 12s. I know you're missing me, so I put some videos on YouTube for you guys. If you're a year 11 biology student as well for GCSE, this will be useful for you too. That's why I put it on Show My Homework for 11 biology Q and U, especially if you want to go into doing your A-level biology. So last time we looked at species diversity and we also looked at classification. This is chapter 10. And we're going sort of towards the end of that now. We're halfway through this. Today we're looking at the human impact on species diversity, on diversity of living things. So a learning objective, how does human behavior impact species diversity? But before we start, we need our recall high five, right? So recall quiz. Number one, definition of biodiversity. What is biodiversity? Number two, what three things make up biodiversity? Number three, what is species richness? Number four, what is the formula for species diversity index? And number five, why is species diversity important? These aren't one-word answers, so have a quick scribble. Pause the video, and once you're ready, we'll go through the answer when you unpause it. So if you've done that and you've unpaused it, let's get back to it. Okay, so definition of biodiversity. Biodiversity is all of the different living things in the community, in an ecosystem or in the world. Okay, so all the variety, all the diverse, all the variety of living things, living organisms within an ecosystem or the world. What three things make up biodiversity? We looked at this last time. We've got species diversity, we've got genetic diversity, and we've got ecosystem diversity. So they're the three things. What is species richness? We didn't actually talk about this last time. But ultimately what species richness is another way of describing species diversity. It's to do with the number of species and the abundance of that species. Now when we do the species diversity index, which we'll come into next, it's all to do with the species diversity. The higher the species diversity index, the more different species you have, and for each of those species you've got lots of them. So they are equally abundant. So there's not just one or two of that particular species, there's like 1,000 of that one, 1,000 of that one, 1,000 of that one, 1,000 of that one, and so on and so on. Okay? So that's what species richness is. What's the formula for species diversity index? It's probably quicker if I just showed you the previous slide so you can see it. The species diversity index then, it looks like this is our previous lesson. There we go. Species diversity index is the big N bracket big N minus 1. That's the total number of the organisms, or total number of species there, okay? And the total number of organisms in total. And then that one is the individual species. So sigma represents the sum of the individual species times by the individual species minus 1. So imagine if you've got 50 species in total, then you do 50 times n minus 1 will be 49, because 50 take away 1 is 49, so that'll be 50 times 49. And then you do it for all the individual species and add them all up. Okay, so that's the answer to question 4, if you've forgotten. Now in the exam, they do actually give you that, but it's useful to memorize it so you get a good understanding of how this equation works, or how this formula works. So that's number 4. And why is it so important? Because the ecosystem becomes unstable and unmanageable if the species diversity index is low. The higher the species diversity index, the more healthier that ecosystem is, and the more tolerant it is of any climate changes or any changes to the environment, so therefore certain organisms could survive, and then that community can still thrive and flourish after anything becomes dead or extinct. Okay, so it sustains life on Earth. And that's why today what we're looking at is how us as a human Homo sapiens species on this planet, as the dominant species, have wrecked the planet and is affecting the species diversity, and we by us destroying the species diversity, we'll ultimately destroy ourselves, because we need the ecosystem to flourish. Because if it doesn't, you get desertification, things die, you get collapsing in ecosystems because food webs just collapse, okay? And then we'll have no food, and we'll have no animals to look at, and plants to look at. So, therefore, maybe no medicines and other natural resources. So what we're focusing on today then is what is the impact of agriculture on species diversity. Now when I'm talking about agriculture, I'm talking about farming. And how do we balance between conservation of the ecosystem by looking after the ecosystem and farming? Because ultimately we need farming. Why? Why do we need farming, first of all? Right, so before I look at the impact of farming, why do we need farms? Well, long time ago, when we were just hunting and gathering, talking about, thousands and thousands of years ago, before civilization, and we were living in our little caves, you had to go out first thing in the morning with your spear, hide behind some bush or some rock somewhere, and try to go and hunt an animal with your spear. And if you brought nothing back that day, your little family would starve and be cold and shivering, right? So you had to go hunting and gathering. That's what we did as nomadic little tribes or little individual pockets of families and stuff. As civilization grew, you don't need to go out hunting and gathering. Your hunting and gathering and my hunting and gathering is going to work. Okay, obviously you're at school, you're training to go to work, but eventually one day you're going to go to work. You're going to have a job. That job is going to pay your wages. That money or your salary is going to go into your bank account. Your hunting and gathering now isn't as exciting and exhilarating as trying to catch your food every day, okay? Because if you don't catch that food, you're going to starve, you're going to go hungry and die. Your hunting and gathering now, the most stress you're going to have is how far is your car in the parking lot, the parking lot, it's not America. How far is your car in the parking place, car park even, from the front door of Tesco? There are other supermarkets available. That's going to be your biggest stress. Have you got a pound coin to put in the Tesco trolley so you can go shopping? Is that going to be your other stress? Is going to be walking around the aisles. How close are you? Are you keeping your 2-meter social distancing space between that person and your person so they're not coughing on you? That's going to be your stress. Your biggest stress might be, have they got your Cocoa Pops? Okay, because you might have run out, or your mini chocolate Weetabix, or your chocolate shreddies, because you're so fussy that you only eat that particular cereal. Okay, so have that might be your stress, right? Back then, that was, thousands of years ago, are you going to have any food or not? Are you going to capture anything? Survival of the fittest, natural selection, okay? Now, our hunting and gathering is going to the supermarket. Your hunting and gathering, might be, for me, is teaching you via the YouTube, the internet right now, or when I'm back at school, will be in the classroom. That's my hunting. My gathering is going to Tesco. Okay, so I can feed, and then my shelter in my cave is this roof above my head. Okay, so this agriculture has changed that. So instead of you having to go fending for yourself and growing your own food, we've got farming industry now that does that all for you, but we need to still make the money, the hunting bit, so that you can pay for that food. There are 7 billion people on the planet, more than 7 billion, there's like 7.5 billion people. When I was a lad, when I was at school, your age, there's only 5 billion people on the planet. So in that time, if you're a good mathematician, like some of you are good A-level students, they're mathematicians, if you're a good mathematician, you should be able to work out very quickly what was the percentage increase. 5 billion people when I was at school, a couple of decades later, you're at school, and yes, you just worked out a couple of decades, I'm that much older than you, yep. Actually, it's more than a couple of decades, I know I don't look that old, but anyhow. Don't say I do. Anyway, so 5 billion when I was at school, 7 billion when you're at school. This is the same, one generation difference. We're not talking about from Egyptian times or Roman times or medieval times. We're talking about just one generation difference, right? So in that one generation difference, what percentage increase has there been? Well, the difference is 7 take away 5, which is, yes, you got it, 2. 2 divided by the original number, which was 5. 2 over 5 times 100, well done, 40%. So in that short, very, very short period of time, when you think of the grand scheme of things, 1 to a couple of decades, in the grand scheme of things, a couple of decades, you've got about 40%. That's nearly half of the world's population has increased in that time. We need resources. Resources in such as things like wood and metals and stuff like that to make our stuff, like our homes and our transportation and cars and all that kind of stuff. We need fossil fuels to transport us, because we haven't got electric stuff yet, although we've got Tesla cars and what have you, but not everyone's got that. But we need food. So all of this food needs to be grown. Where's it to be grown? On farmland. That's going to cause a problem, because we need to feed all those people. And not only do we need to feed those people, we need to feed them at the right price. Because if it costs too much, people can't afford to buy it. People will starve. And there'll be riots in the street, and people won't vote for certain governments, and so on and so on. And the whole economy and civilization collapses. So agriculture is really, really important. But there is a very fine balance between getting it right and horribly wrong. Okay? Where we can impact the area. So, but what does agriculture do? Intensive farming reduces species diversity. So there's two types of farming. You've got intensive farming, and you've got obviously organic, small hold farms as well, like little family farms. Small hold farms are going to be obviously better, but obviously any kind of agriculture is going to impact the land around it, and it's not going to be, if you just let the land naturally just come to a climax community, let it grow by itself, it will have more species diversity and more variety and biodiversity, because it'll just carry on itself. When humans interact with it and just grow whatever they want to grow, it's going to reduce the species diversity. Okay? So that's why. Well, how does it reduce the species diversity? Well, what kinds of things do farmers do? They usually grow one particular thing. So Farmer Giles might be growing carrots. Farmer Smith might be growing sabji. That's vegetables, I think. Other kinds of vegetables, but they might be growing turnips. Farmer Tom might be growing turnips. Farmer Freddie might be growing fruit on his fruit trees, like apple orchard or something like that. So each farmer usually doesn't have a variety of stuff. They usually have livestock, like certain animals, like cows or sheep or chicken or whatever. The ones that are growing the agriculture, the fruit and the vegetables, they tend to grow cereals like wheat and things like that, tend to grow one type of thing. We call it monoculture, mono meaning one, monoculture. So what does that do? Well, we already talked about this. I've sort of annotated all of this. Man is people. I should have said man or woman, it's people. People on Earth, human population, massive increase. More food needed, we need it at a smaller price, less cost. What does that do? It impacts the natural world, because humans are cutting and destroying forests to have the farmland, and they're pumping in lots and lots of natural synthetic fertilizer into the soil. They're also not using organic fertilizer, manure and stuff like that, and this is all reducing biodiversity. What is the impact of agriculture then? Well, over time, the natural ecosystem becomes more complex communities. If you leave it alone, you increase the species diversity. But are we leaving it alone? That's the point we're trying to make here. We're not leaving it alone. Agricultural ecosystems are controlled by humans and are different to your normal complex communities, your climax communities like a meadow. Other things farmers do, they do selective breeding. Why do they do selective breeding? So they can increase the productivity. They want to have really big cows because they can sell the meat for Big Macs or whatever, or steaks or whatever you. They want to have big cows to produce lots of milk, okay, or more creamier milk or whatever you. Now, if you constantly keep inbreeding and selectively breeding, you're reducing the genetic variety, you're reducing the allelic frequency, you're reducing the gene pool, okay? So you're reducing the diversity, the species diversity in an area. You're going to make them economically viable, as in you need to be able to make lots of them, sell them for a price that people can afford to buy. Desired features need to be large. So for instance, your tomatoes, you don't want all your tomatoes to be all bobbly or your carrots to be knobbly and funny shaped. You want them all long. That's why you go to supermarkets and stuff and you open a bag of carrots, they all look almost identical. Because if there's ones that look funny, they get rid of them. It's a waste of food. Okay. Therefore, variety genes from that particular gene frequency, gene pool, gone. Okay. So you've only got those long orange carrots, big ones. A particular area can only support a certain amount of biomass. The soil can only have so much stuff growing out of it because there's only so much naturally chemicals, minerals and fertilizer chemicals inside the soil that are naturally occurring, okay? So like manure, organic nitrates and things like that. So what farmers do is they throw loads of fertilizer into it. So by you growing lots and lots of stuff from the soil, by having your stuff growing, you've got less area for other species to grow. And they have to also compete for the limited amount of resources that are there. So that reduces your survival rate and therefore species diversity decreases. Pesticides are used to exclude certain species as well because they're the ones that are competing for light, mineral ions and water that's in the soil. Okay. So, because these are what the plants need, pesticides will kill the pest. Now, all of this reduces species diversity. And what are the direct impacts that farmers do? Well, one of the things farmers do is they cut down the hedges, the hedgerows. Because hedges are usually found as a barrier between one field and another field. Like one farmer's land, another farmer's land, or it could be your farmland, but you've got this field I'm growing wheat, that field I'm growing some other type of cereal, okay? But you've got hedgerows in between. So you want to make more space, so instead of there being a big gap there, you'll just cut down your hedges. Why is that a problem? Well, hedges are habitats for small creatures. There might be small creatures living underneath the hedgerow, there might be small creatures living at the top of the hedgerow. So again, you cut down the hedgerow, you cut down the habitat, there's none of those species left. Also, you make those two small fields into one massive field and you just grow one thing. You're creating what we call a monoculture. You're just growing one thing, which means you've only got one set of genes in this massive area of land. The other thing that farmers do that has a direct impact to species diversity is they're filling ponds. Now in ponds you might get little frogs, you might have little fish in there, you have little insects and stuff floating around there that are specific for that small microhabitat. Now what farmers do is like, okay, look, there's this big field and oh, there's a big pond there. Or there's an area in the corner of the field that's completely wet and damp, like a marshy area. What they can do is they end up filling up the pond, just throwing soil into it and filling it all up. So all the water's gone, they've drained it, so it's now just soil. Or the bit that's in the corner that's really wet or nothing can grow because it's too boggy, they'll just drain the water out of it and make it all dry again. Now what's that going to do? Remember, these are small habitats for particular organisms that need to live in those sort of wet kind of areas. You're just growing against the same old monoculture. Overgrazing. So overgrazing is you letting your cows, your ruminants, that we used that word last time, ruminants, or there's animals that go around grazing, like sheep and cows and things like that, will go around munching on the Pengis munch, they'll be munching on their grass, going around. If you've got loads and loads of cows and loads of other sheep, they're going around chomp, 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 eating away the grass, going lower and lower and lower and lower. They're taking it away. That stuff that's being used from the soil, all the nitrates and all the organic fertilizer stuff's going through them, all the mineral ions. What tends to happen is they grow big, they die, and they go back into the soil and they keep replenishing the fertility of that soil. By eating all that grass, you're constantly taking away resources from the land, which makes it difficult. If you're overgrazing, you haven't got those grasses and stuff for other little insects to be running around and scurrying around and living and being a little microhabitat for other organisms. What are the indirect impacts? Well, the indirect impacts are things like pesticides and inorganic fertilizers. If you're spraying pesticide, it's more, I suppose, a direct impact in the sense that you're killing a particular insect. So therefore, what you're having is a knock-on effect on the entire food web, because that insect might be eaten like the green fly or an aphid might be eaten by a ladybird. Then that ladybird gets eaten by a spider or something. You kill off all those insects, the aphids, there's no food for the ladybirds die, which means the spiders die. Therefore, a particular bird might die or something. So because they're not enough food. So pesticides can have an indirect impact in the entire species diversity in that area. Okay, and inorganic fertilizer, so like chemical synthetic fertilizer rather than using organic like cow manure and things like that. The escape of effluent. Effluent is basically slurry, like cow poo and sheep poo, or chicken poo, all the feces that comes from these animals. It doesn't just, you don't see a cow sitting on a toilet or a sheep. Okay, it doesn't get flushed away and go down into the sewer network. They just do it where they're standing, right? So that's why you have to take out all the slop or take out all the poo, scrape it out from all the barns and stuff like that. So all of this is called effluent. This effluent, it gets stored in these tanks and things, right? Now, if there's some leakage, not that kind of leakage, but if there was some kind of leakage of this effluent and it gets into the ecosystem, it's going to cause eutrophication, algal bloom. It can cause pollution in certain parts of our ecosystem, in our lakes and our rivers and stuff. But also, it can kill off certain species because it becomes polluted, and then again cause a destruction in the species diversity. The absence of crop rotation and intercropping. Crop rotation is this, where you 1 year you grow, let's say, carrots, but then the next year you've harvested your carrots, and the next year you grow turnips, then the next year you grow potatoes, then the next year you grow broccoli or something like that. Well, why are you growing different things? And then the 5th year you go back to your carrots again. And why are you growing different things every year? It's called crop rotation. It's a good technique to use because what that does is each individual species or plant doesn't require exactly the same balance of mineral ions and water and stuff from the soil going into that plant. So 1 year lots of, let's say, magnesium and potassium is used, but the next year it might be more nitrates and phosphorus or something like that. And then the next year, and what happens is you're constantly letting the land replenish certain minerals over time. Intercropping is where you might grow 1 row of potatoes and then the next row is interweaved. So you might grow a row of turnips and then the next row of carrots and so on and so on. That's what intercropping is. And what that does is it reduces the chance of things like weeds growing in between, because one might be slightly under the other one or quite close together. They'll be competing for the same resources, but it stops the weeds from growing, because weeds will be competing directly for water and minerals and light from the farmers' crops, and therefore their yield, the size of them, will be smaller. Because ultimately what the farmer's got 2 responsibilities. One, to the people, us. He needs to feed us, and he needs to feed us at a reasonable price. So that's his one responsibility, to make sure that the price is all right and he produces more for less money. The other thing is he needs to make a profit. He needs to sell his stuff so he can sell it for a profit, or else what's the point of being in business? Okay. Before, back in the day, when you used to have smallhold farmers, they'd only just make enough food to feed themselves. Like some of your parents might be growing stuff in the garden or in allotments where they're growing their own fruit and vegetables and stuff like that, and then using for themselves. And anything extra they get, they can give to their friends and family. And if you get any extra, if you want to sell it, you can sell it. Okay, that's how farming used to be. Okay, when it was just smallholder farms. But now we've got this mass factory type agriculture. Now, the balance between, how do we balance then between farming and conservation? Because conservation is trying to maintain our species diversity. We want it to be as high as possible. So we want lots of different species, and we want abundance of species, like lots of them. So why do we need it? We need to balance between our needs, what we need, and species diversity to have a healthy ecosystem. Because if we don't have species diversity, species die, ecosystem collapses, it's going to affect us. We won't have food as well. We won't have natural resources. Eventually, it can kill us off as well. So we could be shooting ourselves in the foot. How? Well, these are the list of things then. Based on what we've just talked about, if you maintain your hedgerows, instead of having like fences between them, because what a fence does is just a real thin piece of wood or a thin piece of wiring, metal gate or something, fencing. You've got more vegetation growing, that's what we're trying to do by having the fences. My farm, your farm, like the land. Instead of having fencing, have hedgerows. Okay, maintain the hedgerows and not just chop them down. Okay, because those hedgerows are microhabitats. There's things living underneath them, there's things living on top of them. Okay? Maintain your ponds, even make new ones. Remember, don't fill in your ponds. Leave wet corners, don't drain them, so that wet area can still have stuff living there. Plant native trees. Native means trees that are naturally already from this country, from this neck of the woods, so to speak, pardon the pun. Not bringing spruce from Norway or whatever, some Christmas tree, and planting it there, where it's not, it's native, okay? So stuff that grows in this country, like sycamore and ash trees, what have you, grow them in an area where you've wrecked, it's got low species diversity. Plant something native, like a conker tree or sycamore horse chestnut tree, in a place where there's low species diversity in that field over there, because then eventually it might come to a climax community there. Reduce the use of pesticides. Instead of using chemical sprays and stuff, use a biological control instead. For instance, instead of having the aphids eating away at your crop and you spraying those aphids, if you introduced a few ladybirds into the ecosystem, those ladybirds will eat the aphids. Okay, so therefore they'll control the number of aphids. Therefore, your leaves will be bigger because the aphids are munching on your plant. Your plant's got smaller leaves, less photosynthesis. Plant is smaller, less sugar, less glucose made, less photosynthesis, less respiration. By having these ladybirds, the ladybird doesn't eat your plant, but it eats the thing that's eating your plant. Don't use herbicides. So herbicides are weed killers, spraying it with weed killers. Instead of using herbicides, use what we talked about before, intercropping instead, because that reduces your weeds. Use organic fertilizer, so like manure and things like that, rather than using chemical fertilizer. We talked about crop rotation, grow different crops and use intercropping, so therefore you won't need herbicides. Use nitrogen fixing crops. What are those? Certain plants, leguminous plants, the ones that grow things like peas and lentils, that makes your dal, you know, your taka dal, the lentils, right, the split peas. Those are leguminous plants. In their roots, you're going to learn more about this when you do year 13 work, but in the roots they've got these root nodules, and in there there's bacteria, these symbiotic bacteria. And these bacteria, what they do, instead of the plant having to absorb nitrates directly from the soil, the bacteria makes the nitrates that the plant needs rather than them having to get it from the soil. So therefore the plant can make amino acids straight away, so it can get proteins, so it can grow really quick. It doesn't need to absorb the resources, the nitrates from the soil, the ammonia compounds. So these nitrogen fixing bacteria live in the roots. Now if you've got plants like that, if you grow crops like that, therefore you don't need to absorb as much of the fertility of the soil doesn't drop, because the nitrogen is already in the roots from the bacteria rather than absorbing it from the fertilizer from the soil. Have more natural meadows. Okay, so you got your field to grow your cereals and stuff, but then in the corner you have a natural meadow growing, so you got like wild flowers there. So you can have verges, you can have field edges, and beyond the field edge have your natural meadow growing. And don't cut your field edges or your verges until, because sometimes you just cut it or the grass is growing, cut it, grass is growing, cut it. If you let the grass go right to the top, let the flowers happen, let the seeds disperse, then decide to cut it. So if you just give it a bit more time, that's better. Have natural meadows flourishing, and introduce conservation headlands and wild flowers, and so insects can breed as well. Okay, so these are some of the measures you can take. Now there's one last thing. DEFRA. Who is DEFRA? It's the Department for the Environment, Food, you can say farming, but it's Food and the Rural Agency, DEFRA. It's a really important department in the government where they control all of this stuff. They need to make sure that the farms are doing their job and not wrecking the environment, but producing food that's sustainable, that's not costing an arm and a leg. Not that you're going to eat an arm and a leg. Anyway, that's who DEFRA are, and they're responsible for that. So, last thing, this deforestation thing isn't as in detail in this last bit of this lesson, but it's worth having a quick butchers at it, pardon the pun. Forests cover much of the planet before human interfered. Forests everywhere, like the Black Forest, Nottingham Forest. That was a joke for Joe, by the way, because he doesn't like Nottingham Forest. For some reason, he thinks Notts County are a team. But anyhow, so numerous habitats, ground, lots of organisms living around in the ground of the forest, in the middle of the trees, the branches, and then right high up in the canopy of the trees, right at the top. All sorts of different organisms and species living in there. If you increase the number of habitats, the more different adaptations they have, you increase the species diversity. Tropical rainforests have the highest species diversity of any ecosystem on the planet. So talking about places like the Amazon rainforest, okay? Very, and that's why us slash and burning these rainforests for farmland is an absolute devastation, because we're going to be making lots of different species extinct just by slashing and burning. Deforestation, mostly human, obviously, like slash and burn. Why? Farming, wood for furniture, for paper, for building materials for houses and stuff, because people need places to live, furniture, but also some are forest fires that can happen naturally, and some obviously there's some arson attacks as well. Why agriculture? We said this, grazing, housing, reservoirs even, and then the pollution by burning those forests leads to acid rain, because you get sulfur dioxide dissolves in the atmosphere, in the clouds, and comes down as sulfuric acid. Deforestation then reduces your species diversity, and as an estimate of we're losing about 50,000 species each year. Now bearing in mind, I said there's about 1.8 million species that we know of, we're losing 50,000 a year. If you do the maths, it's not going to take many years for all our species that we know of to be wiped out. Okay, so we need to do something about it. So tropical rainforests cover about 7% of the Earth's surface, but like I was saying, the Amazon, they have about half of all the world's species. So if an estimate, oh, my battery's running out. If, for instance, we cut down these rainforests and we don't reforest them, we don't grow more trees in place, then these species, half of the world's species, can be wiped out, because we're cutting down these rainforests so quickly. The size of Wales is being lost every year or something from the Amazon rainforest. Every day there's so many size of Wembley Stadium, the football pitches are being chopped down every day. Not only of the impact of acid rain from all the pollution, from all the slashing and burning, but also we're losing all the organisms. Right, my battery's about to die, so this is the exam question. It's an AQA question from 15 years ago. Shows you how old my slideshow is. Deforestation then often involves clearing large areas of forest for use as agricultural land. Deforestation reduces the diversity index of area cleared this way. Explain why. So that's 2 marks. So pause the video, have a go at that question, and then I'll quickly go through the answer when you've unpaused it. Okay, so if you had a go at that question, so deforestation often involves clearing large areas of land. We talked about slashing and burning. Reduce the diversity index of the area cleared. Why? Well, if you're cutting down those trees, well, number one, the trees themselves are different species. If you're chopping them down, you can make them extinct, because you're cutting them down for the natural resources, for things like furniture, housing, and all that kind of stuff. However, by chopping those trees down, those trees are habitats for other organisms. If their habitats are destroyed, therefore the species will have nowhere to live. They will eventually become extinct as well. So therefore your species diversity is massively reducing. So that's the end of how humans impact the species diversity. If it's been useful, I'm glad that you're learning something. Please share if you haven't done so already. Subscribe to My Smart Learning on YouTube if you haven't done so already. Please watch them all, like them, and I'll see you next time. But I've got to make sure I give you your high five, because I don't think I've given you your virtual high five. So it's a high five from me, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.